Is there a mid-cap equity sweet spot? Often overlooked in favour of other size ranges and investment practice in an academic literature, mid-cap stocks have distinct characteristics that may be useful to market participants seeking to diversify sector, size and factor exposures. Well, I'm Jenny Ellis from Asset TV. I'm joined today by Hamish Preston of S&P Dow Jones Indices and Ryan Reardon of State Street Investment Management for a fundamental look at US mid-cap equities and to look under the hood of the S&P MidCap 400 Scored and Screened Leaders Index. Hamish, Ryan, good to have you with us today.
Great to be here.
So Hamish, I'm going to come to you first. And how does S&P Dow Jones Indices define mid-cap equities and how have they performed historically?
Sure. So S&P Dow Jones Indices' preeminent US mid-cap equity index is the S&P MidCap 400. Now, this 400 company index uses various criteria that new index additions have to meet before they can be considered eligible for the index. And one of those screens is a size threshold. So at the time of recording, new index additions need to have a market capitalization of between $8 billion up to $22.7 billion. Now, these thresholds are reviewed regularly and have been updated throughout history. Now, if we take a step back, what's potentially interesting about the mid-cap US equity space is that the breadth and depth of the US equity market means that the mid-cap space is as large as entire countries' equity markets. So if you treated the S&P 400 as a standalone country, it would be one of the largest equity markets in the world. Coupled with its distinct exposures compared to the S&P 500 from a sector perspective and also a revenue exposure perspective, the 400 is typically more domestically focused and as a result has been more correlated to US GDP growth. That potentially is relevant for people looking to express views on the health of the US economy, for instance. And finally, just from a performance perspective, since the 1990s, the S&P 400 has outperformed both the S&P 500 and the S&P Small Cap 600. And it's been the choice of constituents rather than differences in sector weights that have typically driven that outperformance. And so what that really points to is mid-caps potentially being in a sweet spot of the business cycle, maybe overcoming some of the hurdles more commonly associated with small caps, but perhaps with room to grow compared to their large cap counterparts.
And Ryan, how have mid-cap equities historically been used? And what are some of the potential applications in this current landscape?
Yeah, it's actually really interesting. I think the S&P 500 is such a well-known and recognizable index that it's more or less synonymous with the US equity space. And everybody is familiar with sort of small cap, smaller companies. But in a market like the US market, there's this huge mid-cap segment that Hamish is talking about. And when you move down the market cap spectrum, the first thing you'll notice is that the smaller the company is, the more locally focused it is. And so as an example, mid and small cap US stocks are typically about 80-20, 80% domestic revenue, 20% international revenue. At the mega cap sort of S&P 500, that can go up to 50-50 or even 60-40. So the first thing you notice is that mid caps are a pure play on sort of the domestic market, the US consumer, as sort of Hamish highlighted. So a lot of our clients are seeing strategic opportunities there to reflect a view in their portfolio that is more tied to the relative strength of the US economy. But then also tactically, there's headlines around global trade disruptions and issues related to tariffs. When you're more domestically focused, in theory, you're less sort of dependent upon those sorts of areas and more it's about, what is the employment situation? What is the relative strength of that economy? And so we've seen a lot of money pour into US small cap and mid cap stocks as a sort of diversification play away from the areas that have been working within the S&P 500 like the Magnificent Seven.
And how does sustainability apply to mid-caps?
Sustainability is very interesting. It applies to most of our investors and clients' portfolios. So we noticed this when about 5 years ago, we provided a sort of S&P 500 scored and screened option for investors. The numbers on that are about 1 to 6. So about $1 of every $6 opts to go into a sort of sustainable focused core equity exposure. So overwhelmingly, investors prefer sort of the traditional sort of S&P 500 exposure. And so with respect to mid-caps, S&P 400, we've seen about $2 billion go into the S&P 400 exposures in the last 1 year. And we thought we are going to have a large client base that's going to want sort of an Article 8 sustainable option to go along with this. So for us, it's about providing optionality to the investors. And so it's not about S&P 400 or S&P 400 scored and screened. It's about providing both options to investors so that you can play that sort of US mid-cap theme through either the sustainable lens or the traditional lens.
And Hamish, finally, can you tell me more about the S&P MidCap 400 Scored and Screened Leaders Index and what makes it unique?
Sure. So the index was launched in April 2025, and it uses the S&P 400 as a starting universe. And it looks to measure the performance of those companies from the S&P 400 that have above average S&P Global Environmental, Social and Governance, or ESG scores. While excluding companies that derive revenues from certain business activities or are not compliant with UNGC. Now, the index design itself looks to retain certain characteristics of the S&P 400, for example, industry group weights. So although index performance is not specifically mentioned in the Scored and Screened Leaders Index objective, that similarity of industry group weights has contributed to a similarity of index performance compared to the S&P 400 historically. Coupled with the improvement in the S&P Global ESG score of the Scored and Screened Leaders Index compared to the S&P 400, what it means is that this index may be relevant for people looking to incorporate sustainability perspectives while retaining certain characteristics of the flagship US equity mid-cap index.
Well, clearly lots of reasons to consider US mid-caps there. Well, Hamish, Ryan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, to learn more about the S&P MidCap 400 and the S&P MidCap 400 Scored and Screened Leaders Index, including S&P Dow Jones Indices' latest research and data, visit the link below.